The great chamber of the Galactic Convergence Council stretched for miles in every direction. Thousands of beings from across the galaxy sat in floating platforms arranged in perfect circles. Each species had their own section, decorated with symbols and colors from their home worlds. The air hummed with translation devices working overtime to convert hundreds of languages into something everyone could understand. At the center of it all sat the council speaker, Zarthun of the Ancient Ones. His species had been traveling between stars when most others were still learning to make fire. His pale blue skin glowed softly as he looked over the assembly. Today's meeting was supposed to be routine. Trade disputes, territorial agreements, and minor complaints. Nothing that should take more than a few hours to resolve. In the observer section, Ambassador Sarah Chen sat quietly with her small human delegation. Humans were the newest members of the council. Accepted only 50 years ago, most species still saw them as an interesting curiosity rather than a real power. Their home planet, Earth, was in a quiet corner of the galaxy. They had only 12 colony worlds, all of them small farming or mining settlements. Chen watched as various alien representatives brought their problems before the council. The methane breathers wanted new shipping routes. The crystal singers needed help with space pirates near their territory, standard stuff that the council had been handling for thousands of years. Then, war-cased Vorthak of the Kralix hegemony stepped forward. Vorthak was an impressive sight, even by galactic standards. Standing nearly 9 feet tall, his body was covered in thick, gray scales that looked like armor plating. His forearms ended in claws that could tear through metal. His species had evolved from pack hunters on a high-gravity world, and it showed in every movement he made. The Kralix controlled 200 star systems and had a reputation for being tough but fair. They followed the rules of civilized warfare that had kept the galaxy mostly peaceful for over 3,000 years. When they wanted something, they used economic pressure or limited military displays. Clean, efficient, and nobody had to die. Honored Council. Vorthak spoke, his voice carrying easily through the chamber's acoustics. I come before you today to address a matter of galactic security. The human colonies exist in a dangerous region of space. Pirates, rogue asteroids, and unstable stars threaten these innocent people every day. Chen felt her jaw tighten, but she remained silent. She knew what was coming. The Kralix hegemony offers our protection to these vulnerable worlds, Vorthak continued. In exchange for this service, we ask only for reasonable tribute, raw materials, agricultural products, and access to their shipping routes. A small price for guaranteed safety. The council chamber filled with the alien equivalent of murmurs. This was how things worked in galactic politics. Strong species protected weaker ones in exchange for resources and influence. It was considered civilized, even generous. The alternative was letting the weak fend for themselves until they were destroyed by accidents or genuine threats. Speaker Zarthun nodded approvingly. The offer seems fair. What evidence do you present of the dangers facing human space? Vorthak activated a holographic display that filled the air above the chamber floor. Star charts appeared, showing human colonies marked in red. Around them, Vorthak highlighted various threats. Pirate attacks have increased by 30% in this sector. The star system of Beta Centauri shows signs of instability. And here, he pointed to another area, a rogue black hole is affecting nearby gravity wells. It was impressive showmanship. The threats were real, even if they weren't as serious as Vorthak made them sound. The pirates mostly attacked isolated cargo ships. The star instability wouldn't affect planets for another 1,000 years. The black hole was barely large enough to matter, but the council didn't know those details. They saw a strong species offering to protect a weak one. Standard galactic politics. The humans may respond, Zarthun announced, looking toward the observer section. Chen stood slowly. At 5.5 feet tall, she looked tiny compared to most beings in the chamber. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple style, and she wore a plain blue uniform with Earth's symbol on the shoulder. Nothing about her suggested she was anything special. The United Terran Federation has reviewed the Kralix offer, she said, her voice calm and clear. The translation devices carried her words to every corner of the chamber. The council expected one of several responses. Perhaps a request for time to consider the offer. Maybe a counterproposal for different terms. Some species tried to negotiate better tribute rates or protection guarantees. Others asked for council mediation to work out details. Chen did none of those things. The United Terran Federation formally rejects the Krallick's demand for tribute, she announced. Furthermore, any Krallick's military vessels found in human space after 72 hours will be considered hostile. A strange silence fell over the chamber. That wasn't how these things worked. Weaker species didn't refuse protection from stronger ones. They certainly didn't make threats about what would happen if the offer was ignored. Vorthak's 4 eyes widened in what might have been amusement. The human representative seems confused about galactic realities. Perhaps she needs time to consult with her superiors on Earth. I speak with full authority from Earth and all human colonies, Chen replied. The Krallick's hegemony has 72 hours to withdraw all military assets from human space. Now the chamber erupted. Beings who had been quietly observing suddenly came alive with excited chatter. The ethereal collective, masters of mathematics and probability, immediately began calculating odds of human survival. The hive minds started sharing information at light speed. Even the ancient ones leaned forward with interest. Speaker Zarthun raised one pale hand for silence. Ambassador Chen, you seem to misunderstand the situation. The Krallicks have offered protection, not made demands. Rejecting such generous terms could leave your people defenseless against genuine threats. We understand the situation perfectly, Chen said. The Kralliks want our resources and submission. We decline to provide either. Vorthak let out a sound that the translation devices couldn't properly convert. It came through as aggressive laughter mixed with contempt. Small human. Do you know what you are saying? The Krallick's hegemony controls 900 warships. We have conquered 40 star systems through proper civilized warfare. Your species has 23 ships total. Most of them converted cargo vessels. Chen nodded calmly. We are aware of the military balance. Then you know resistance is impossible. Accept the tribute arrangement, and your people can continue their simple lives in peace. Refuse, and face the consequences. The chamber held its breath. This was the moment when weaker species always backed down. Faced with overwhelming odds, they would ask for council mediation or accept modified terms that saved face while giving the stronger power what they wanted. Chen looked directly at Vorthak. When she spoke, her voice carried to every corner of the vast chamber. The United Terran Federation formally declares war on the Krallick's hegemony. The silence that followed was absolute. In 3,000 years of council history, no one had ever declared war. Conflicts were resolved through negotiation, economic pressure, and limited military displays that minimized casualties and property damage. War was what primitive species did before they learned civilized behavior. Speaker Zarthun stared at Chen as if she had just announced her intention to eat a star. Ambassador, surely you mean to request council mediation to resolve this dispute? No mediation is required, Chen replied. The Kralliks have 72 hours to comply with our demands. After that, we will begin military operations to remove their forces from human space. Vorthak's laughter filled the chamber. So be it, little human. Your species will learn why the galaxy follows civilized rules of warfare. We will demonstrate proper conquest techniques on your colonies. Perhaps the survivors will be wiser than their leaders. Chen nodded once and returned to her seat. Around the chamber, thousands of beings tried to process what they had just witnessed. The newest, weakest member of the council had just declared war on a major galactic power. The betting began immediately. The council chamber buzzed with activity for hours after Ambassador Chen's declaration. Beings who had lived for centuries tried to understand what they had just heard. War was not something that happened in civilized space. It was a concept from the Dark Ages, before the council established proper rules for resolving disputes. Speaker Zarthun called for an emergency recess. In the private chambers behind the main hall, council leaders gathered to discuss this unprecedented situation. The Ancient Ones, who remembered the last real conflicts in the galaxy, shared worried glances. The ethereal collective ran probability calculations at maximum speed. Even the emotionless synthetic republic seemed agitated. "This cannot be allowed to proceed," declared Councillor Vex of the Trade Federation. "If species start declaring war over simple tribute requests, it will destroy our entire system of peaceful resolution. The humans clearly don't understand galactic customs," added Representative Kala from the neutral zones. "They've only been council members for 50 years. They probably think war means the same thing as a formal protest." Zarthun wasn't so sure. Ambassador Chen seemed very clear about her meaning, and she spoke with authority from Earth's government. "Authority to do what?" Vex laughed. "Commit species suicide? The Kralliks will demonstrate proper warfare techniques. The humans will surrender within days, and we can all go back to civilized behavior." Outside the private chambers, the main hall had turned into something like a sporting event. Beings who normally spent their time on trade negotiations and territorial surveys were making bets on how long humanity would last. The odds were not good for the humans. The probability masters of ethos calculated a 0.003% chance of human victory. The merchant princes offered 10-to-1 odds on human surrender within the first week. Even species known for supporting underdogs weren't willing to bet on humanity. War-cased Vorthak stood in the Kralliks delegation area, surrounded by his military advisors. Unlike the confused council members, he was pleased with the day's events. A proper demonstration of Kralliks' military superiority would remind the galaxy why his people commanded respect. "Ready the third battle fleet," he ordered his communications officer. "Standard conquest formation. I want orbital platforms around every human world within 10 days. "What level of resistance should we prepare for?" asked Fleet Commander Zektar. Vorthak considered the question. Human ships were primitive by galactic standards. Their largest vessels were barely the size of Kralliks escort frigates. Their weapons were projectile-based rather than energy weapons. Most importantly, they had never fought a real interstellar war. "Minimal resistance," he decided. "Their ships will probably surrender as soon as they see our fleet. If any are stubborn enough to fire on us, disable them quickly and move on. We're here to teach a lesson about civilized warfare, not to exterminate them." The Kralliks' military doctrine was well established and had worked perfectly for centuries. First, you demonstrated overwhelming superiority to convince the enemy that resistance was pointless. Then you offered reasonable surrender terms that allowed them to save face while giving you what you wanted. If they were still stubborn, you applied economic pressure until they came to their senses. It was clean, efficient, and humane. Nobody had to die unnecessarily, and the defeated species usually ended up better off under Kralliks' protection. Vorthak had personally overseen 7 such operations, and all of them had concluded successfully within 30 days. The humans would be even easier than usual. They had no real military tradition, no advanced weapons, and no allies willing to risk Kralliks' displeasure by helping them. The operation would probably be over before the council finished debating whether to intervene. While the Kralliks prepared their fleets and the council argued about proper procedures, something strange began happening in human space. Ships that had been visible on galactic tracking systems simply vanished from sensors. The Trade Federation noticed first. Human cargo vessels that regularly transported goods between colonies stopped responding to traffic control signals. Mining ships that had been working asteroid belts went silent. Even the passenger shuttles that connected human worlds to council space disappeared from the shipping schedules. "Technical problems," explained the Galactic Commerce Authority when asked about the missing ships. "The humans are probably updating their communication systems or conducting maintenance, but the pattern was too widespread to be coincidence." Within 48 hours of Chen's declaration, nearly every human vessel in known space had gone dark. Only Earth itself maintained any communication with the outside galaxy, and even those signals were limited to basic trade frequencies. The Kralliks weren't worried. Primitive species often tried to hide their ships when faced with superior military force. It was a natural but pointless response. Krallik sensors could track energy signatures across multiple star systems. When the time came to begin operations, they would locate every human vessel and deal with them appropriately. What Vorthak didn't know was that human ships weren't hiding. They were transforming. In the deep space between stars, cargo vessels that had carried grain and manufactured goods for decades were being converted into something else entirely. Civilian crews who had spent their careers moving freight between colonies were learning new skills. Engineers who had designed mining equipment were building weapons that had no equivalent in galactic civilization. The galaxy operated on the assumption that warfare was a specialized activity conducted by professional military forces using standardized equipment. The Kralix battle fleet consisted of purpose-built warships crewed by trained soldiers who had studied combat as a career. Their weapons were energy-based. Their tactics were proven, and their doctrine had never failed. Humans approached the problem differently. Every human vessel was potentially a military asset. Every colony had manufacturing capability that could be turned to weapons production. Most importantly, every human understood that when their species declared war, it meant something very different from the galaxy's polite conflicts. Ambassador Chen returned to Earth aboard a fast courier ship, leaving her deputy to handle routine council business. The journey gave her time to review the intelligence reports that had been flooding in since the Kralix made their tribute demand. Human intelligence services had been watching the Kralix for months, ever since their fleets began moving closer to human space. Unlike other galactic species, humans assumed that military threats were serious until proven otherwise. Chen's declaration of war hadn't been an emotional response to Vorthak's arrogance. It had been the culmination of careful planning. The intelligence files made for sobering reading. The Kralix had 900 warships, advanced orbital bombardment capability, and planetary shield technology that could protect their homeworlds from most attacks. Their military was professional, experienced, and had never lost a major engagement. But the files also revealed weaknesses. Kralix doctrine was entirely based on the assumption that their opponents would fight according to galactic conventions. Their ships were designed for intimidation rather than actual combat. Their supply lines were vulnerable because no one had ever seriously threatened them. Most importantly, the Kralix had never fought an enemy that didn't care about civilized rules of warfare. As Chen's ship approached Earth orbit, she could see the signs of her people's preparation. Orbital factories that had been building mining equipment were now producing something else. Military installations that had been quietly mothballed were coming back online. The planet itself was transforming into something the galaxy had never seen before. A world preparing for total war. Chen's aide handed her the latest report from military command. Admiral Santos confirms that all fleet elements are in position. She requests permission to begin Phase 1 operations on schedule. Chen looked out at the stars where Kralix forces were gathering. Soon, those ships would discover what humans meant when they declared war. The galaxy was about to learn a lesson in the difference between civilized conflict and the kind of warfare that humans had been practicing for thousands of years. "Tell Admiral Santos she has full authorization," Chen said quietly, "and remind her that the galaxy is watching. Let's make sure they understand that humanity is not interested in being anyone's tribute." The Kralix Third Battle Fleet assembled at the edge of human space exactly 72 hours after war-cased Vorthak's ultimatum. 900 warships arranged themselves in perfect formation, their hulls gleaming with biometal that could repair itself from minor damage. Each vessel was a work of art as much as a weapon of war, designed to intimidate enemies into surrender through sheer magnificent presence. Fleet Commander Zektar stood on the bridge of his flagship, studying the tactical displays. Human space looked pathetically empty. Only a few scattered energy signatures showed where their colonies maintained basic life support and communication systems. No military formations were visible. No defensive positions had been established. It was exactly what he had expected from a species too primitive to understand the realities of galactic warfare. "Begin standard intimidation protocol," Zektar ordered. "I want every human colony to see our fleet arriving. Full sensor sweeps, maximum energy signatures. Let them understand the futility of resistance." The Kralix ships moved forward in textbook formation. Their energy shields blazed with colored light that could be seen from hundreds of thousands of miles away. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time, designed to make enemies realize they were facing a force beyond their ability to resist. On the colony world of New Geneva, human settlers watched the alien fleet approach through telescopes and sensor arrays. The sight should have sent them into panic. Instead, they calmly activated emergency protocols that had been drilled into them since childhood. Within hours, the civilian population had moved to underground shelters that could survive orbital bombardment. The Kralix detected the population movement and interpreted it as expected behavior. Primitive species always tried to hide when faced with superior military force. It was a natural but pointless response. Kralix orbital bombardment systems could crack open any underground facility if necessary, but that wouldn't be required. Once the human ships were disabled or destroyed, the colonists would surrender to avoid starvation. What the Kralix didn't notice was that the humans had activated other systems as well. Manufacturing facilities that had been producing farm equipment for decades were now building something else entirely. Communication arrays that had been used for civilian purposes were suddenly broadcasting encrypted military signals across multiple star systems. Most importantly, the humans had no intention of hiding underground until their ships were destroyed. They were preparing for a very different kind of fight. Commander Maria Santos floated in zero gravity aboard her flagship, reviewing final preparations. The ship around her didn't look like much from the outside. The Defiance had started life as a heavy cargo hauler, designed to move mining equipment between star systems. Its hull was scarred from years of loading and unloading industrial machinery. Its engines were efficient but not particularly fast. Nothing about it suggested military capability. That was exactly the point. Santos checked her tactical display. 11 other converted cargo vessels hung in space around her, all of them appearing to be civilian ships that had stumbled into the wrong place at the wrong time. The Kralix fleet was still hours away, but their sensor sweeps had already detected the human vessels. According to intercepted communications, the aliens were puzzled by what they saw. Kralix command to unknown vessels, came the transmission. You are in a declared combat zone. Withdraw immediately, or be considered hostile. Santos smiled grimly. The aliens were still thinking like civilized galactic citizens. They gave warnings. They offered chances to retreat. They followed rules designed to minimize casualties and property damage. Humans had different rules. All ships. This is Santos. She broadcast on the human command frequency. Remember the plan. No responses to alien communications. No surrender signals. No retreat. We're here to teach these creatures what humans mean by war. The human task force continued its approach toward New Geneva. From the Kralix perspective, it looked like a suicide run by desperate civilians trying to protect their colony. 12 cargo ships against 900 military vessels was beyond hopeless. It was tragic. Fleet Commander Zektar felt genuine sympathy for the humans. Their courage was admirable, even if their tactics were suicidal. Signal to human vessels, he ordered. Offer them safe passage to withdraw. No species should have to watch their people die pointlessly. The message was transmitted on all frequencies, translated into every known human language. The Kralix ships slowed their advance, giving the humans time to reconsider their position. It was a generous gesture that had saved lives in dozens of previous conflicts. The human ships didn't respond. They didn't slow down. They didn't change course. They just kept coming. Perhaps their communication systems are damaged, suggested Zektar's tactical officer. Should we disable their engines to force them to stop? Negative, Zektar replied. We'll capture them intact if possible. Their crews might have valuable information about human defensive capabilities. What the Kralix didn't realize was that the 12 ships approaching them weren't actually 12 ships at all. Each human vessel was a cluster of smaller craft held together by magnetic clamps and structural frames. What looked like a single cargo hauler was actually 3 separate ships disguised as one. As the distance closed, the human formations began to change. Santos watched her tactical display as the Kralix fleet moved into standard capture formation. The aliens were spreading out to surround her ships, planning to disable their engines and take them prisoner. It was textbook galactic warfare, designed to minimize casualties while demonstrating overwhelming superiority. All ships, prepare for separation. Santos ordered. "Remember, they're not expecting us to fight. They're expecting us to surrender. Let's show them the difference." The Krallic sensors detected the energy buildup just moments before the human ships began to split apart. What had appeared to be 12 cargo vessels suddenly became 36 smaller craft, each one accelerating at rates that should have been impossible for civilian ships. "What are they doing?" Zektar demanded from his bridge. "Those acceleration rates will kill their crews." His tactical officer was already running calculations. "Commander, those aren't cargo ships. The energy signatures are all wrong. Those are warships, disguised as civilian vessels." But even that assessment was wrong. The humans weren't operating warships in any sense that the galaxy would recognize. Each small craft carried exactly one weapon system and just enough life support to keep its crew alive during the attack. There were no backup systems, no safety margins, no provisions for retreat or surrender. They were kamikaze vessels, designed for a single purpose: destroying enemy ships. The Krallic fleet began evasive maneuvers, but their ships were too large and too focused on intimidation, rather than actual combat capability. The human vessels were small, fast, and completely expendable. More importantly, they were armed with weapons that the galaxy hadn't seen in thousands of years. Santos's ship fired first. The projectile that emerged from its single launcher was crude by galactic standards. No energy beams, no exotic particles, no sophisticated targeting systems. Just a chunk of dense metal accelerated to 15% of light speed by chemical explosives and magnetic fields. The Krallic shields were designed to stop energy weapons and slow-moving objects. They had never been tested against kinetic impactors traveling at relativistic speeds. The projectile punched through the shield like it wasn't there and slammed into the alien hull with the force of a small nuclear bomb. The first Krallic ship to die did so in complete silence, its biometal hull simply vaporizing from the impact. There was no time for distress signals, no opportunity for damage control. One moment it was there, the next it was an expanding cloud of superheated plasma. Across the Krallic's fleet, commanders stared at their displays in shock. Energy weapons could be defended against, boarding parties could be repelled, economic sanctions could be negotiated. But this was something completely outside their experience. These humans were using actual weapons of war. "Return fire," Zektar shouted. "All ships, engage with maximum force." The Krallic's fleet opened up with everything they had. Energy beams designed to disable enemy systems lashed out toward the human vessels. But the humans weren't trying to preserve their ships or protect their crews. When a Krallic's energy beam struck a human vessel, it often found nothing vital to damage. The crew compartments were heavily armored. The weapon systems were redundant, and the ships themselves were considered expendable. More human projectiles streaked through space, each one carrying something that made the Krallic's commanders wish they had never heard of the human species. These weren't just kinetic weapons. They were nuclear warheads, designed to create massive electromagnetic pulses that would blind Krallic sensors for crucial seconds. In those seconds of blindness, the humans did something that violated every rule of civilized warfare. They launched boarding pods. These weren't the diplomatic negotiation teams that usually handled ship-to-ship disputes. These were soldiers in environmental suits carrying weapons specifically designed to destroy Krallic's vessels from the inside. Chemical agents that would dissolve biometal, explosives that would rupture life support systems. Most terrifying of all, they were prepared to die to complete their missions. As the first Krallic ships began to fall, Fleet Commander Zektar realized that everything he thought he knew about warfare was wrong. These humans weren't fighting to capture territory or negotiate better terms. They weren't trying to demonstrate superiority or force a surrender. They were fighting to destroy their enemies completely. "Emergency transmission to Krallic's command," Zektar ordered, his voice shaking. "We are under attack by an unknown enemy using prohibited warfare techniques. Request immediate reinforcement and authorization to use enhanced combat protocols." The response came back within minutes. "Impossible. Humans have no military capability. Maintain standard operations and complete the mission." Zektar looked at his tactical display, where another Krallic ship was dying in nuclear fire. Around him, His bridge crew was staring at their instruments in disbelief. "Sir," his communications officer reported quietly, "we've lost 40 ships in the first hour. The humans aren't responding to surrender demands or negotiation offers." Zektar understood that his fleet was facing something that galactic civilization had forgotten how to handle, an enemy that didn't care about rules, didn't want to negotiate, and wasn't interested in anything except total victory. The humans had declared war. Now the galaxy was learning what that actually meant. The council chamber had been converted into an emergency command center, with real-time feeds from the battle zone displayed on massive holographic screens. Beings who had never seen actual warfare watched in growing horror as the engagement unfolded. What they were seeing defied everything they understood about civilized conflict resolution. Speaker Zarthun stood motionless before the primary display, his pale blue skin flickering between colors that indicated deep distress. Around him, council members from dozens of species struggled to process what their sensors were reporting from human space. "This cannot be correct," whispered Councillor Vex of the Trade Federation. "The readings show that the humans are winning." The probability masters of Ethos had been running calculations continuously since the battle began. Their quantum computers, capable of processing millions of variables simultaneously, kept producing the same impossible result. The Krallick's Third Battle Fleet, one of the most powerful military forces in the galaxy, was being systematically destroyed by converted cargo ships. "Our mathematics must be flawed," declared Prime Calculator Nexus. "No species achieves this level of combat effectiveness without centuries of military development. The humans have been in space for less than 200 years, but the sensor data didn't lie. In the first 6 hours of combat, the Kralliks had lost over 300 ships. The human casualties were minimal by comparison, partly because their vessels were smaller and harder to target, but mostly because they approached warfare with a completely different philosophy. When a Krallik ship was damaged, its crew followed standard protocols: attempt repairs, signal for assistance, and withdraw. If the situation became untenable, their biometal hulls could heal minor damage automatically, and their redundant systems were designed to keep ships operational even after significant hits. When a human ship was damaged beyond repair, its crew did something that horrified the watching galaxy. They aimed their crippled vessel at the nearest enemy ship and activated their remaining weapons at point-blank range. The humans called it a ramming attack, and it was devastatingly effective against Krallik's vessels that had never been designed to handle suicidal enemies. Fleet Commander Zektar watched another of his ships die in nuclear fire as a human vessel deliberately crashed into it. The humans aboard the attacking ship had to have known they would die in the collision, but they had done it anyway. It was a level of tactical ruthlessness that no galactic species had demonstrated in millennia. "Sir, the humans are boarding the cruiser Vorthax Pride," his tactical officer reported. "The boarding parties are not responding to surrender signals from our crew." Zektar pulled up the internal sensors from the besieged ship. What he saw made him question his understanding of how warfare was supposed to work. The human boarding parties weren't trying to capture the ship or take prisoners. They were systematically destroying everything they encountered. Krallick's crew members who tried to surrender were ignored. Life support systems were sabotaged. Computer cores were destroyed with explosive charges. The humans moved through the ship like a plague, turning functional military equipment into useless scrap metal. "Why aren't they taking prisoners?" Zektar wondered aloud. "Even the most aggressive species follow basic rules of war." His communications officer looked up from her station with an expression of complete bewilderment. "Sir, I don't think they know there are rules." That was the moment when Zektar finally understood what his fleet was fighting. These weren't galactic citizens who had forgotten proper warfare techniques. These were beings from outside the civilized community, operating according to principles that predated the Council's peace accords by thousands of years. The humans were fighting total war. In the Council chamber, emergency sessions were being called by species that had never before experienced genuine military concern. The Crystal Singers, whose civilization was based entirely on peaceful harmonics, were demanding immediate intervention. The neutral zones wanted the entire human species declared a galactic threat. Even the warlike Krallik's allies were questioning whether their traditional methods could handle this new threat. "We must stop this immediately," declared Ambassador Thel of the Cooperative Commonwealth. If this continues, it will shatter the foundations of galactic peace. Speaker Zarthun was studying intelligence reports that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. The human attack on the Kralix fleet wasn't an isolated incident. Across human space, similar battles were erupting as Kralix forces encountered resistance they had never imagined possible. On the colony world of New Geneva, human civilians had emerged from their underground shelters to attack Kralix landing parties with improvised weapons. Instead of surrendering when faced with superior firepower, they had continued fighting with whatever they could find. Farming equipment had been converted into weapons. Industrial chemicals had been turned into explosives. Children as young as 15 were participating in combat operations. "This is madness," Zarthun said quietly. "How can an entire species ignore the basic principles of civilized behavior?" The answer came from an unexpected source. Ambassador Chen had returned to the council chamber, still wearing her simple blue uniform, still appearing completely unremarkable among the exotic aliens around her. But now the other council members looked at her with something approaching fear. "Honored Speaker," Chen said calmly, "you asked to understand human behavior. The answer is simple. We don't recognize the authority of your peace accords because we never agreed to be bound by them." The chamber fell silent. For 3,000 years, the Council's rules had been considered universal law. Every species that achieved interstellar travel eventually joined the Council and accepted its authority. It was the foundation of galactic civilization. All intelligent species accept Council authority once they understand its benefits, Zarthun replied. Peace, prosperity, and protection for all. How can you reject such obvious advantages? Chen's expression didn't change. Because we've learned that peace without the ability to defend yourself is just slavery waiting to happen. The Kralix demanded tribute from our colonies. You expected us to pay it to avoid conflict. That's not peace. That's submission. On the tactical displays, another Kralix ship died as human boarding parties detonated its reactor core. The explosion lit up the surrounding space with radiation that would make the area uninhabitable for decades. The humans responsible for the sabotage had certainly died in the blast, but their sacrifice had eliminated an enemy vessel that could have threatened human colonies for years. Warcast Vorthak himself appeared on the communication channels, his four arms gesticulating wildly as he demanded to speak with human commanders. The proud Kralix warrior who had confidently demanded tribute just days earlier now looked desperate and confused. "This is Vorthak of the Kralix hegemony," he broadcast. "I demand to negotiate with human military leaders. We are prepared to discuss modified terms for the tribute arrangement." The human response was typically direct. Commander Santos appeared on screen from her flagship, her uniform torn and her face streaked with smoke from combat damage. Behind her, human technicians worked frantically to maintain their ship systems while preparing for the next engagement. "War-cased Vorthak," Santos said without preamble. "The United Terran Federation does not negotiate with forces occupying our territory. Withdraw all Kralix military assets from human space immediately, or we will continue destroying them." Vorthak's eyes widened in disbelief. "You cannot continue this slaughter. We are prepared to reduce the tribute demands by 50%. Surely that demonstrates our good faith?" Santos looked directly into the camera, her voice carrying the weight of authority that came from watching her people die for their freedom. "There will be no tribute. There will be no negotiation. Remove your forces from our space, or we will remove them for you." The transmission cut off, leaving Vorthak staring at a dead communication channel. Around him, his staff officers looked at their commander with growing panic. In their entire military history, no enemy had ever refused to negotiate once the fighting began. "Sir," his intelligence officer reported quietly, "our losses now exceed 400 ships. Human casualties appear minimal. They're using tactics that maximize our losses while preserving their own forces." Vorthak tried to understand how such a thing was possible. The Kralix had overwhelming technological superiority. Their ships were larger, faster, and more heavily armed. Their crews were professionally trained warriors with centuries of experience. By every measure of galactic military science, they should have achieved total victory within hours. Instead, they were losing a war against an enemy that fought like barbarians from the galaxy's prehistoric past. The truth was that human military doctrine had been shaped by thousands of years of warfare against their own species. They had learned to fight enemies who were just as intelligent, just as determined, and just as well equipped as they were. Every human weapon, every tactical approach, every strategic concept had been tested against opponents who understood warfare as thoroughly as they did. The Kralliks had spent centuries fighting enemies who followed galactic rules of engagement. They had never faced an opponent that was genuinely trying to kill them. As reports flooded in from across the battle zone, one fact became clear to everyone watching. The humans hadn't just declared war on the Kralliks. They had declared war on the entire concept of civilized conflict resolution, and they were winning. In the council chamber, Ambassador Chen stood quietly while beings who had ruled the galaxy for millennia tried to comprehend what they had witnessed. The newest member of their community had just demonstrated that their 3,000 years of peace had made them forget the most basic truth about intelligent life. Sometimes, the only way to preserve your freedom is to be willing to fight for it. The galaxy was about to learn what that meant. 3 weeks after Ambassador Chen's declaration of war, the Kralliks' hegemony formally surrendered. The surrender ceremony took place aboard a human vessel in neutral space, with representatives from major council species present as witnesses. What they saw would reshape galactic politics for centuries to come. War-cased Vorthak stood before a simple metal table aboard the human flagship Defiance. The once proud warrior looked like he had aged years in the past weeks. His biometal armor was scratched and dented, and his forearms trembled slightly as he signed the surrender documents. Around him, human soldiers stood at attention with weapons that still bore scorch marks from recent combat. The terms of surrender were harsh by galactic standards, but they were also simple. All Kralliks' forces would withdraw from human space immediately. The hegemony would pay reparations for the cost of the war. Most significantly, 12 Kralliks' worlds would be placed under human administration for the next 50 years, ensuring that the hegemony could never again threaten human colonies. Commander Santos read the terms aloud in a voice that carried no emotion. She had lost many friends during the fighting, and her ship still showed battle damage that would take months to repair. For her, this wasn't a moment of celebration. It was simply the end of a necessary task. The Kralliks' hegemony acknowledges defeat in armed conflict with the United Terran Federation, she announced to the assembled witnesses. All military operations in human space will cease immediately. Reparations will begin within 30 days. Any violation of these terms will result in renewed hostilities. Vorthak signed his name with a hand that shook from exhaustion and defeat. In 3 weeks of warfare, his people had lost over 700 ships and their reputation as a galactic military power. More importantly, they had learned that some enemies could not be intimidated, negotiated with, or conquered using civilized methods. The humans had shown the galaxy what total war actually meant. When they destroyed enemy ships, they made sure those ships could never fight again. When they captured territory, they eliminated any possibility of counterattack. When they made demands, they backed them up with the demonstrated ability to destroy anyone who refused to comply. As news of the Kralliks' surrender spread across the galaxy, species that had never worried about military threats began reassessing their defensive capabilities. The Trade Federation quietly began recruiting military advisors. The neutral zone started developing weapons research programs. Even the peaceful crystal singers began discussing the possibility that their harmonic defenses might not be adequate against an enemy that didn't follow galactic rules. The probability masters of Ethos released a new calculation that sent shockwaves through the council. According to their mathematical models, any galactic power that attempted to fight humanity using traditional methods would have less than a 12% chance of victory. The humans had developed warfare techniques that were specifically designed to counter every defensive system the galaxy relied upon. But it was the psychological impact that truly changed everything. For 3,000 years, council species had resolved conflicts through negotiation, economic pressure, and limited military displays. The possibility of actual destruction had been eliminated from galactic politics. Everyone understood that wars were won and lost at conference tables, not on battlefields. Humanity had demonstrated that this assumption was wrong. They had shown that a species willing to fight total war could defeat any opponent that restricted itself to civilized methods. More terrifyingly, they had proven that such wars could be won quickly and decisively by forces that seemed inferior on paper. When Ambassador Chen returned to the council chamber, she found herself facing a very different reception than she had received just weeks earlier. Council members who had previously ignored humanity now studied her every movement. Species that had never shown interest in human affairs were suddenly eager to establish trade agreements and mutual defense pacts. The observer section, where humanity had sat for 50 years, was no longer appropriate. Speaker Zarthun personally escorted Chen to the primary council area, where the galaxy's most powerful civilizations conducted their business. The council recognizes the achievements of the United Terran Federation in resolving their conflict with the Kralix hegemony, Zarthun announced formally. We welcome humanity as a full member of the galactic community, with all rights and responsibilities that such membership entails. It was the fastest promotion in council history. Humanity had gone from ignored observers to major galactic powers in less than a month. But Chen understood that their new status came with expectations that went far beyond simple membership. The Council requests that humanity consider taking on peacekeeping responsibilities in disputed regions, Zarthun continued. Your demonstrated military capabilities make you ideally suited for maintaining order in areas where traditional diplomatic methods have proven insufficient. Chen nodded slowly. She had expected this request. The galaxy had spent 3 millennia avoiding actual warfare. But now they faced the possibility that other species might learn from humanity's example. If the Council wanted to prevent the spread of total war tactics, they needed someone capable of stopping such conflicts quickly and decisively. The United Terran Federation is prepared to assist in maintaining galactic peace, Chen replied carefully. However, we will do so according to human military doctrine. Species that threaten others with military force should understand that we consider such threats to be acts of war. The implications of that statement rippled through the chamber. Humanity wasn't just offering to serve as galactic peacekeepers. They were announcing that any species which tried to use military intimidation against weaker neighbors would face the same treatment as the Kralix. In the weeks that followed, the effects of humanity's victory became clear across the galaxy. Territorial disputes that had simmered for decades were suddenly resolved through negotiation, as species realized that military threats might provoke human intervention. Piracy in border regions dropped to almost nothing when word spread that human patrol ships didn't take prisoners. Trade routes that had been disrupted by aggressive species were reopened under human protection. The galaxy was learning to live with the knowledge that total war was once again possible. But they were also discovering that the threat of such warfare could be just as effective as actual combat in maintaining peace. The Kralix hegemony, meanwhile, found itself in an entirely new situation. The 12 worlds under human administration were being transformed according to human standards. The tribute system that had supported Kralix expansion was dismantled. Military installations were converted to civilian use. Most significantly, the populations of conquered Kralix territories were being given the opportunity to choose their own governments, for the first time in centuries. War-cased Vorthak himself had requested a private meeting with Ambassador Chen during the surrender negotiations. The defeated commander wanted to understand how his people had been beaten so thoroughly by what he had considered a primitive species. Your tactics violate every principle of civilized warfare, he told Chen during their conversation. How can you justify such brutality? Chen's answer was simple and direct. We justify it by results. Our colonies are safe. Our people are free. Your empire can no longer threaten anyone. If that's not worth fighting for, then what is? Vorthak struggled to understand how any species could accept such massive casualties in pursuit of military objectives. The human losses during the war had been significant by galactic standards, even though they were minimal compared to Kralix casualties. How could a civilization function when its people were willing to die rather than accept defeat? Your species will destroy itself eventually, he predicted. No civilization can sustain that level of aggression indefinitely. Chen smiled at that, though there was no humor in her expression. War-cased Vorthak, Humans have been fighting wars against each other for our entire history. We've survived nuclear weapons, biological warfare, and conflicts that killed millions of our people. We learned to control our aggressive impulses not by eliminating them, but by directing them against external threats. She gestured toward the holographic display showing the surrounding star systems. The galaxy has been peaceful for 3,000 years because no one remembered what war actually meant. Now you know. The question is whether that knowledge will be used to prevent future conflicts or to prepare for them. In the months that followed the war, other species began to study human military history with growing fascination and horror. They discovered records of conflicts that had consumed entire continents, weapons capable of destroying all life on a planet, and tactical concepts that treated massive casualties as acceptable losses in pursuit of strategic objectives. Most disturbing of all, they learned that humans had developed these capabilities while fighting against their own species. Every human weapon, every tactical innovation, every strategic concept had been tested against opponents who were equally intelligent and equally determined to win. The galaxy had assumed that peaceful species were inherently superior to warlike ones. Humans had proven that peaceful species were simply those that had never faced a genuine threat to their existence. When that threat appeared, the choice was simple: learn to fight or accept defeat. As Ambassador Chen took her seat in the primary council chamber for the first time as a full member, she reflected on how much had changed since her people first made contact with galactic civilization. 50 years ago, humans had been eager to join the peaceful community of spacefaring species. They had tried to adapt to galactic customs and follow council protocols for resolving disputes. But when those protocols failed to protect human colonies from aggression, humanity had reverted to what they knew best. They had fought a war according to their own rules, and they had won decisively. Now the galaxy understood that humanity's peaceful behavior had been a choice, not a weakness. They had chosen to follow council rules because those rules served their interests. When the rules failed, they had demonstrated their ability to succeed without them. Speaker Zarthon called the session to order, and the business of galactic governance resumed. Trade disputes were resolved, territorial boundaries were adjusted, and development projects were approved. But underlying all of it was a new awareness that the galaxy had fundamentally changed. For the first time in 3,000 years, war was once again a possibility. And everyone knew exactly which species they would call if that possibility became reality. Ambassador Chen listened to the debates with patient attention, occasionally contributing observations about human perspectives on various issues. Her presence in the chamber was a constant reminder that the galaxy's newest member was also its most militarily capable. When disagreements arose between council members, they were resolved more quickly than usual. No one wanted to discover what would happen if a dispute escalated beyond the council's ability to mediate. Humanity had declared war on the Krallick's hegemony, and the galaxy had watched in astonishment as the assumptions underlying 3 millennia of peace were shattered. But they had also learned that sometimes the threat of war was the most effective way to preserve peace. The age of humanity had begun.